It was a typical sunny afternoon in Florida. Jamie and Sarah, a couple in their late 30s, decided to take advantage of the warm weather and head to a quieter stretch of beach near the Gulf Coast. The area wasn't a tourist hotspot, just a small, secluded cove they had stumbled upon during one of their weekend drives. The beach was perfect. Soft white sand, gentle waves, and not a single person in sight. They set up their towels, umbrella, and cooler. The isolation felt peaceful, a rare escape from their busy lives. As the hours passed, they fell into a relaxing rhythm. Sarah dozed off under the umbrella while Jamie wandered the shore, collecting shells and small pieces of driftwood. It was during one of these walks that Jamie noticed something odd in the distance, a single flip-flop half buried in the sand. It wasn't unusual to find abandoned items on the beach, but this one was different. The edges of the sandal were frayed and scorched, as if it had been burned. Jamie's brow furrowed. He looked around, expecting to see someone nearby, but the beach was still empty. "Hey, Sarah," Jamie called as he walked back to their spot. "You've got to see this." Sarah sat up, shielding her eyes from the sun. Jamie handed her the flip-flop. "What do you think happened to it?" he asked. "Looks like it went through a fire or something," Sarah said, turning it over in her hands. "But that's weird. Where would there be fire here?" Jamie shrugged. "Maybe a bonfire from last night. Or someone's grill." Sarah nodded, but her gaze lingered on the charred edges. Something about it unsettled her. As the afternoon wore on, they noticed more peculiar things. A child's beach bucket, cracked and half-melted, lay near the waterline. Further up the shore, Jamie spotted what looked like a piece of fabric fluttering from a mangrove tree. When he approached, he realized it was a torn shirt, salt-stained, sun-bleached, and also singed along the edges. "This is getting weird," Jamie muttered, glancing around. He felt an unexpected prick of unease. Sarah was feeling it too. She suggested they pack up and leave, but Jamie, brushing off the strange discoveries, insisted on staying just a little longer. "It's probably just trash washed up from a boat or something," he reasoned. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The beach, once a haven of calm, now felt oppressively silent. The occasional cry of a seagull or the rustle of palm fronds seemed distant, muffled. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the sand, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach churn, a faint outline of footprints leading away from the water and into the nearby trees. "Jamie," she whispered, her voice tight. "Those prints. They weren't there earlier." Jamie turned, following her gaze. The prints were uneven, as if whoever made them was limping or dragging something. The couple stood frozen for a moment, the warm Florida breeze suddenly feeling colder. "All right, let's go," Jamie said, his voice tense now. They hurriedly gathered their things, keeping a wary eye on the tree line. As they walked back toward the car, the eerie silence followed them. It wasn't until they reached the edge of the parking lot that Sarah glanced back one last time, and swore she saw a figure standing among the mangroves, watching them. "Jamie, look," she started, but when he turned, the figure was gone. Neither of them spoke much during the drive home. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Her mind kept replaying the day's events, her heart racing every time she thought about those footprints. Who, or what, had been there with them on that deserted beach? The next morning, Jamie decided to check online for any news about the area. It didn't take long before he stumbled upon a chilling detail. The cove they had visited was the site of a tragic boat fire a few years back. A family of 4 had been aboard when the vessel caught fire and sank just off the shore. Only one body was ever recovered. Jamie didn't mention this to Sarah, but from that day on, Neither of them returned to that beach. The unsettling memories of the day at the beach lingered, but life moved on. Jamie and Sarah didn't talk about it much, Sarah because she didn't want to dwell on the fear, and Jamie because he didn't want to scare her with what he'd learned. But a few nights later, something odd happened. Jamie was sitting on the couch scrolling through his phone while Sarah was getting ready for bed. A faint, rhythmic sound broke the quiet of their home, soft tapping, like someone drumming their fingers against glass. "Did you hear that?" Jamie called out, his voice tight. Sarah appeared in the doorway, toothbrush in hand. "Hear what?" Another tap. This time, Sarah heard it too. Jamie stood and moved toward the sliding glass door that led to their backyard. The porch light was off, and the moon cast long shadows over the lawn. He peered through the glass but saw nothing. "Probably just the wind," he muttered, but as he reached to close the curtains, his breath caught. On the other side of the glass, faint and almost imperceptible in the moonlight, was the shape of a wet footprint. "Jamie." Sarah's voice trembled. She had seen it too. Jamie forced a laugh. "Must have been from earlier," he said, trying to sound casual. "Maybe I tracked something in and it dried weird." But they both knew it wasn't true. The footprint was on the outside of the glass. The next few days were uneventful, though the couple couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The noises, the odd sense of unease, it all felt like a bad dream they couldn't wake up from. One evening, as Jamie was locking up, he noticed something else. Near the front door, in the flower bed, was another footprint. This one was clearer than the one on the glass. It was barefoot, larger than his own, and the edges looked slightly burned, just like the flip-flop they'd found on the beach. Jamie didn't mention it to Sarah. He didn't want to worry her more than she already was. But the next morning, Sarah found something Jamie couldn't hide. Sitting on their porch, perfectly placed in the middle of the welcome mat, was the same charred flip-flop they had seen on the beach. Sarah froze. "Jamie, how is this possible?" Jamie didn't have an answer. They debated calling the police, but what would they even say? That a burned flip-flop had mysteriously appeared on their porch? That they felt like someone, or something, was following them? Instead, they decided to install cameras around the house. It was an expensive but necessary step to regain some peace of mind. For a while, it worked. The cameras didn't capture anything unusual, and the strange occurrences stopped. They began to convince themselves it had all been a series of coincidences, a stray animal, a prank, or just their imaginations running wild. But one night, around 3 a.m., Jamie woke to a notification on his phone. The camera at the back of the house had detected motion. Heart pounding, he opened the app. The footage was grainy in the darkness, but clear enough to see a figure standing at the edge of the yard. It didn't move, didn't approach, just stood there, staring at the house. Jamie felt his throat tighten. He tapped Sarah awake and showed her the screen. "Call the police," she whispered, clutching his arm. But before they could, the figure stepped closer. In the pale glow of the porch light, they could make out more detail. The figure was barefoot, its clothes tattered and wet, with dark stains trailing down the fabric. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. The police arrived half an hour later, but by then there was no sign of anyone. They searched the yard, the street, and even the nearby woods, but found nothing. "Probably a vagrant," the officer suggested. "Someone passing through." Jamie nodded, though he didn't believe it. That night, neither of them slept. They lay in bed, clutching each other, every creak of the house making their hearts race. Around dawn, Jamie finally drifted off, only to wake with a start an hour later. Sarah was sitting up in bed, staring at her phone. Her face was pale. "What is it?" Jamie asked, his voice hoarse. Without a word, Sarah handed him her phone. It was a still image from the camera footage taken earlier that morning. The figure had returned, standing just feet from the house. But this time, there was a second figure standing beside it. And behind them, in the distance, was the unmistakable glow of a fire. Jamie's stomach dropped as he stared at the image on Sarah's phone. The second figure was smaller, its posture hunched, like a child hiding behind the first. And the fire in the distance. It wasn't just a glow. The faint outline of a boat's silhouette flickered in the flames. "What is this?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Jamie couldn't answer. Instead, he got out of bed, grabbed the baseball bat he kept in the closet, and turned on every light in the house. Sarah followed, clutching her phone and checking the live camera feed. The yard was empty. When the sun rose, they searched the area, but there were no footprints, no signs of anyone near the house. The only thing out of place was the smell, a faint, acrid scent of smoke in the air. That morning, Jamie made a decision. "We're not staying here," he said firmly. They packed their bags and drove to a hotel an hour inland, planning to figure out their next steps. The house didn't feel safe anymore, and Jamie wasn't willing to wait for whatever, or whoever, had been visiting to come closer. The following day, Jamie contacted a local historian who specialized in the Ares maritime history. He explained the strange events, omitting some of the more unbelievable details. The historian listened quietly before leaning back in his chair. "You said this happened near a small cove?" the man asked. Jamie nodded. "There's a story about that place. A few years ago, there was a fire on a boat, a family of 4. They were out celebrating the parents' anniversary. Something went wrong, and the boat caught fire. A few people on shore claimed they heard screaming, but didn't know where it was coming from until it was too late. The Coast Guard found only one body, one of the kids. The others were presumed drowned." Jamie felt a chill run down his spine. "Locals say you can still hear the family calling for help on quiet nights," the historian continued. "But that's just folklore. The currents in that area are strong. It's not uncommon for wreckage or personal items to wash up on the beach years later." Jamie and Sarah exchanged a glance. "Do you think—" Sarah began, her voice shaky. The historian raised an eyebrow. "Think what?" Jamie shook his head. "Never mind." They returned to their home 2 weeks later, after replacing the cameras with a more advanced system and installing motion-activated floodlights. 4 months, everything was normal. They began to feel like themselves again, convincing each other that the events had been a string of coincidences, a lost sandal, a wayward drifter, their imaginations heightened by a creepy story. But Jamie never forgot the smell of smoke that morning. And every now and then, late at night when the house was quiet, Sarah would wake to the sound of faint tapping on the glass. She never had the courage to look. It was an early morning in Florida, and the air was already thick with humidity. Matt and Claire, a married couple from Jacksonville, had driven 3 hours south to visit a lesser-known beach they'd read about online. The blog described it as pristine, untouched, and a perfect escape from the crowds. When they arrived, the beach looked exactly as promised. The sand was white and powdery, the water was calm, and not a soul was in sight. They parked their car on the shoulder of a narrow, unmarked road and carried their cooler and chairs down a winding path through tall sea grass. "This is amazing," Claire said, setting her chair down near the waterline. "Yeah, it's like we've got the whole place to ourselves," Matt replied. The couple spent the morning swimming, sunbathing, and enjoying the peaceful isolation. Around noon, Matt decided to take a walk along the shoreline while Claire stayed back, flipping through a magazine. As he wandered, Matt noticed how unusual the beach felt. There was no driftwood, no shells, no seaweed, just miles of perfect, undisturbed sand. The only footprints were his own. A few hundred yards down, Matt stopped when he saw something half buried in the sand. It was a wallet, old and weathered, its leather cracked from exposure. Curious, he picked it up and opened it. Inside was a faded driver's license. The photo was difficult to make out, but the name read, Michael Hayes. The issue date was from 1982. Matt furrowed his brow. Who would leave something like this behind? And why was it in such good condition after all these years? He looked around, suddenly uneasy. The beach stretched on endlessly in both directions, and he couldn't see Claire anymore. He slipped the wallet into his pocket and turned back. When Matt returned to their spot, Claire was standing by the water, her arms crossed. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice sharp. "I just walked down a bit," Matt said. "Why?" Claire pointed to the sand. "Your footprints. They just stopped. I couldn't see where you went." Matt frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I was just over there." He gestured toward the direction he'd come from. Claire shook her head. "No, Matt. I walked that way looking for you. There was nothing. No prints, no you, nothing." Matt hesitated. "That doesn't make sense. Look, I found this." He pulled the wallet from his pocket and handed it to her. Claire examined it, her expression shifting from confusion to concern. "This is strange. Where did you find it?" "Just down the beach," Matt said. "It's probably just some old thing that washed up." Claire opened the wallet again, but this time something was different. The driver's license was gone. "Matt," she said, her voice trembling, "it was here a second ago." "What?" He grabbed the wallet and checked it himself. The pockets were empty, no ID, no money, no cards. Just worn leather. "Let's leave," Claire said quickly, folding her chair. "Wait, we don't even know what this is." "Maybe, Matt," she interrupted. "Please." Reluctantly, Matt agreed, and they packed up their things. As they made their way back to the car, the air grew heavier, the silence around them almost oppressive. When they reached the path through the sea grass, Matt stopped and turned back toward the beach. His jaw dropped. "What is it?" Claire asked, following his gaze. The beach was gone. In its place was a flat expanse of wet, grey sand stretching to the horizon. The waves lapped lazily at the shore, but the beach they had spent the day on, the perfect white sand, the untouched serenity, was completely gone. Claire grabbed his arm. "Matt, we need to go." They hurried back to the car, throwing their gear into the trunk and slamming the doors shut. As Matt started the engine, Claire glanced back toward the beach one last time. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing on the wet sand. It was distant, barely visible, but it was enough to make her shiver. Matt, drive. He didn't need to be told twice. Back at home that evening, the couple tried to make sense of what had happened. Matt searched online for the name Michael Hayes. He found a news article from 1983 about a man who had disappeared while fishing near the same beach they had visited. His boat had washed ashore a week later, but his body was never found. Claire, meanwhile, unpacked their cooler and beach bags. She froze when she saw the wallet sitting at the bottom of the bag. It wasn't empty anymore. Inside was the driver's license, along with a folded piece of paper. Her hands shaking, Claire unfolded the note. The handwriting was barely legible, scrawled and water-damaged, but the message was clear. Leave. Don't come back. Weeks passed, but the unsettling events of that day never fully left Matt and Claire. They tried to move on, to convince themselves it had all been a trick of the mind or just a strange coincidence. But deep down, they both knew something had happened that they couldn't explain. One evening, after a long day of work, Matt was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He paused when he saw a familiar image, a photo from the beach. It was posted on a local community board for Florida beaches. The caption read, "Mysterious disappearance at Florida's hidden beach? Experts baffled." Matt's heart raced. The beach they had visited was now the subject of an article that claimed there had been unexplained disappearances in the area for decades. Several locals shared stories of strange occurrences, footprints that vanished, people who reported walking down the beach only to lose time and find themselves miles away from where they started. One comment caught Matt's eye: "That place is cursed. The locals know better than to go there. Don't go back. Trust me." He felt the weight of it settle in his chest. Claire had been right all along. There was something wrong with that beach, something they couldn't escape. That night, Matt barely slept. Every creak in the house made him jump, and he kept replaying the events in his mind. The wallet, the missing driver's license, the beach that had disappeared. It was as if the whole place had never existed at all. The next morning, Claire was getting ready for work when Matt brought up the community board post. "I think we should just forget about it," she said quietly, not looking up from her phone. "We've been through enough. I can't just forget, Claire. There's more to this. Something isn't right." "Matt, we can't keep digging into this," Claire replied, her voice tight. "What if it's better left alone?" He stared at her, unsure of what to say. He wanted to understand what had happened, but part of him was afraid of what they might find if they kept looking. That night, Matt couldn't help himself. He returned to the community board, reading more comments and messages from others who had experienced similar strange events. He found a post from someone claiming to have known the original owner of the land before it had been developed into a public beach. The post was old, written years ago, but it caught his attention. The land used to be owned by a man named James Harper. He was obsessed with the idea of preserving the beach. He believed it was connected to an old shipwreck and that the spirits of the sailors still haunted it. Some say he was trying to communicate with them. I don't know what happened to him, but after he disappeared, strange things started happening. Matt felt a shiver run down his spine. James Harper. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. He searched online, finding an old news clipping about a man who had vanished under mysterious circumstances in the early 1980s, the same time as the shipwreck. It was starting to make sense, but the more Matt uncovered, the more he realized how dangerous this investigation could be. A week later, Matt and Claire received a package in the mail. It was an envelope with no return address. Inside, there was a photograph of the beach, the very spot where they had been. In the photo, the sand was pristine, but in the background there was something out of place, a shadowy figure standing by the water, its features blurred, almost as if it wasn't fully there. The back of the photo had a note written in faded ink. "You've seen it. Now you're part of it. There's no leaving." Claire stared at the note, her face pale. She looked up at Matt, her eyes wide with fear. "Matt, we have to leave. This isn't just some strange coincidence anymore. It's something more." Matt nodded, his mind racing. He couldn't explain it, but he knew they had to get away from this place, from whatever was haunting them. They didn't speak much for the next few days. They took time off work and began preparing to leave, moving quickly, as if time was running out. They even looked into relocating, but every option felt like a temporary solution. The feeling of being watched, of something unseen and dangerous lurking just beyond reach, hadn't gone away. On the day they were packing the last of their things into the car, Claire turned to Matt with a somber look on her face. "I think it followed us," she said quietly. Matt stopped in his tracks, his hand frozen on the door handle. "What do you mean?" "I don't know how to explain it, but every time I close my eyes, I see the beach. It's like it's imprinted in my mind. And every time I look outside, I feel like something's waiting for me. I don't think we can run from it." Matt's heart sank. He couldn't shake the feeling that Claire was right. No matter how far they went, it seemed like the beach was already a part of their lives, woven into their memories. As they drove away from their home, they couldn't help but glance nervously at the rearview mirror, wondering if they'd see something, or someone, lurking in the distance. They never spoke of the beach again. And though they tried to move on, Matt and Claire both knew they would never truly escape the haunting pull of that place. Months passed, and Matt and Claire tried to rebuild their lives in a new city, away from the memories of the beach and the unease that had followed them. They had a small apartment now, far from the coastline, surrendered by the mundane comforts of normal life. Still, there was a lingering tension between them, a constant reminder that something unexplainable had happened, something they couldn't escape. One rainy evening, Claire received a phone call. It was from a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, it was someone from their old community board. The voice on the other end was shaky, urgent. "Are you Claire? From the beach? You have to listen. It's happening again. More people are disappearing. It's like they're being erased from time." The voice trailed off, and Claire felt her blood run cold. "Who is this?" she asked, her hands trembling. It's someone who knows what happened," the person whispered. "But I'm too scared to say too much. Just don't go back. Ever." The line went dead. Claire turned to Matt, her face pale. She didn't need to say anything. Matt could see the terror in her eyes. This wasn't over. Whatever had been haunting them, whatever had pulled them into that cursed beach, wasn't done with them. A few days later, they received another envelope. It was identical to the one they'd gotten months ago, the photograph of the beach, the figure in the background, the cryptic note. But this time, the message was different. "You thought you left. You never did." Matt looked at the photograph again. The shadowy figure was closer this time. It almost seemed to be looking directly at them. For the first time in months, they both felt the same cold realization. They couldn't run. They couldn't hide. The beach, or whatever it was, had followed them, and there was nowhere left to go. They were trapped in a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. The following week, Matt went back to the community board, desperate for any answers. The posts had become more frantic, the voices of other people who'd experienced similar things now desperate and filled with fear. But one post stood out to him, a message from someone claiming to know the truth. It read, "The beach isn't just a place. It's a doorway. And once you've been to it, you're tied to it. Forever." There were no further details. The user's profile had been deleted. But Matt knew what that meant. They had opened something, walked into something they didn't understand, and now it was never going to let them go. A few months after the phone call, Claire began to notice something strange. Every night, when she closed her eyes, she would see flashes of the beach, shadows, the faint sound of waves crashing, and a figure standing near the water. Sometimes it would feel like someone was standing right behind her, breathing softly, waiting for her to turn around. Matt was also losing sleep, waking up at odd hours of the night with a feeling of dread hanging over him. He could never fully shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting for the moment to strike. One night, as they were lying in bed, a soft knock echoed through the apartment. It was so quiet, so faint, that Matt almost convinced himself it was a figment of his imagination. But Claire had heard it too. They both sat up at the same time, their hearts racing. Another knock. Then another. "Do you hear that?" Claire whispered. Matt nodded, but he was already getting out of bed. As he reached for the door, he froze. There was a shadow, just beyond the peephole, a figure standing there, unmoving. "Who is it?" Matt called out. There was no answer, only silence. And then the shadow moved, slowly, deliberately, as if it were aware that Matt was watching. Suddenly, the door handle began to turn, and Matt stepped back in fear. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew it wasn't going to be anything good. The door burst open, but there was no one there. The next morning, Matt and Claire packed what little they had left and left the apartment. They drove, without a destination in mind, unable to stay in one place for too long. They knew the truth now. There was no escape from the beach, from the shadows that had followed them. They were part of the story now, forever tied to the mysterious place they had visited. And though they never spoke of it again, they both knew one thing for sure. The beach hadn't disappeared. It was still out there, waiting, and it would never let them go.